The air was warm. That was the first thing she felt. Not cold, not bitter, not the slow biting cold she had walked through for 3 days. Warm, a thin current of warmth drifting against the side of her face like breath from a sleeping animal. She stopped where she stood. The canyon around her sat hushed beneath a fresh skin of snow. The stream at her feet had frozen solid in the early dark of evening, and the cliffs above her bled blue shadow into the gathering night. Her boots had cracked the ice with each step. Her breath had hung in the air like smoke from a wet fire. Everything in this place belonged to winter, and yet Henrietta Sumner turned her head slowly. The warmth was still there, faint, steady, brushing the bare skin between her cheek and the wool wrap she had pulled around her ears. She was 18 years old. She had been put out of her stepfather's house 3 weeks earlier. She had eaten her last hot meal 4 days back. She had $23 in a tin folded inside her coat pocket and a kerosene lantern in one hand and a wool blanket strapped across her back and a half-starved dog of no particular breed walking 3 paces behind her wherever she went. She had walked into this canyon because nobody else came here in winter, because the Trapper Road bent away from it, because the old men in Drummond crossed themselves when its name came up. She had wanted a place where no one would look for her. She had not wanted a miracle, but warm air does not come out of a frozen wall of stone. Not in Montana, not in December, not in a year when the bitter roots were already locked under early ice and the weatherman had ridden through town the day before saying the worst was still ahead. She turned her body fully now, slow, the way a hunter turns toward sound. The warmth touched her left cheek, then her right as she pivoted. She closed her eyes for a moment and let it find her. Whatever it was coming from the cliff. Her heart, which had been keeping the cold time of a body running low, began to move differently. Not faster, steadier, the way a heart moves when it knows something the rest of the body has not caught up to yet. She lifted her lantern. She took 1 step toward the rock wall, then another. Behind her, the dog whined softly low in its throat, the way a dog will whine when it senses a door about to open. That was how it began. But the beginning was earlier than that. The beginning was a kitchen in late autumn of the year before, in a farmhouse south of Drummond, and the last sound her mother ever made. Delphine Sumner had been a small woman with strong hands. She had taught her daughter to bake bread before the girl could read. She had taught her to skin a rabbit and salt it down. She had taught her how to bank a fire so it would still be warm at sunrise, how to mend a coat seam in the dark, how to sing the second part of a hymn without crowding the first. She had been the kind of woman who could hold a household together with nothing but a clean apron and a steady voice. The cough started in October of 1898. By November, she was thin. By December, she could not climb the porch steps without resting halfway up. By the end of January, the doctor from Drummond had come twice and shaken his head both times. He left a bottle of dark liquid that did nothing and a bill that did. He told them what they already knew. He told them to keep her warm and to keep her comfortable, and that the rest was not in his hands. She died on a Sunday morning in February of 1899 with her daughter holding her right hand and her husband standing in the doorway. Etta remembered the silence afterward, not the grief. The grief came later, in pieces over months. What she remembered was the silence in the room when her mother's breathing stopped. She remembered how her mother's hand, which had been so warm a moment before, began at once to cool. She remembered how her stepfather stood in the doorway and did not come closer. He looked at the bed. He looked at the floor. He did not look at her. Then he turned and walked out. That was the first sign. The months between her mother's funeral and the night she heard the voices behind the barn passed without leaving much mark. The funeral itself had been small. There had been 4 people there besides Etta and Theron, an elderly cousin of her mother's who had ridden in from Avon and turned around the same afternoon, the doctor from Drummond and 2 women from the church. Delphine had once gone to before the cough had made her too tired to go. The minister had said the things ministers say. The women had brought a covered dish. Theron had stood with his hat in his hand at the edge of the grave and had said nothing, and when the dirt began to go into the hole, he had turned his face away. Etta had not turned her face away. She had watched the dirt go in. She had thought while she watched that this was the only piece of her mother that she would see again, and that she did not intend to look away from it. In the spring she had planted the garden alone. In the summer she had canned the tomatoes and the beans and the wild plums by herself, the way her mother had taught her, with the kitchen door open and a fly screen across it, and the long afternoon light coming in low across the floor. She had worked. She had eaten supper alone at the kitchen table most evenings because her stepfather was not there, and on the nights he was there, she had not minded the silence as much as she might have, because the silence was at least an honest thing. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. There was between them a long, quiet kind of agreement not to ask of each other what each of them already knew the other could not give. Theron Doyle had married Delphine Sumner when Etta was 9 years old. He was a tall, lean man with a slow voice and slow hands, and for the first few years he had been kind enough. He had patched the barn roof when it sagged. He had taught Etta how to drive a wagon team in close quarters. He had, on the rare occasions he laughed loud enough to fill a room, but there had always been a part of him that lived somewhere else. Etta had seen it without knowing what it was, a look that came over him sometimes when he sat on the porch in the evening, a way he had of staring at the road as if waiting for a rider who would never come. She had thought when she was small that he was lonely. She had thought when she was older that he was bored. She learned the year her mother died that he had been neither of those things. He had been gambling. Helena was a long ride south. A man could leave on a Friday and be back by Sunday night if he hurried and his horse was good, and Theron Doyle's horse had always been good. He had been making that ride for years, some weeks twice. He had been losing money he did not have to men he could not afford to know, and the only thing keeping the farm out of their hands had been Delphine, and the thing about Delphine that had kept the farm out of their hands had been the small inheritance she had brought into the marriage from her own father, an inheritance that had been in her name and not in Theron's, and that she had paid the bank with at the end of every quarter for 9 years without once mentioning it to her daughter, because she had not been a woman who spoke about money where a child could hear. Now Delphine was in the ground, and the men in Helena did not wait long. The summer passed. The harvest came in thin that year. Theron rode south more often than he had when Delphine was alive. He came back later. The farm began to slip in small ways that only a woman of the house would have noticed, and there was no longer a woman of the house. Fence rails leaned that had been straight in June. A horse went lame that should not have. Theron sold it for less than it had been worth and bought another that was worth less still. Etta watched all of this without speaking. She did not have the standing in the household to speak. She had only the standing of a child, which is to say none, although she was no longer a child, which is to say she was the only person in the house who saw what was happening and the only person in the house who could not say so. Etta heard the argument by accident. It was the second week of November. The snow had come early that year, and the wind was up against the side of the barn that night, and she had gone out at dusk to bring in the last of the firewood, and she had heard voices behind the barn before she could come around the corner. So she had stopped, so she had listened, so she had learned. The other man's voice was not loud. That was the worst part. A loud man can be frightened. A quiet man cannot. The quiet man was telling her stepfather what was going to happen and when. He used the words by the end of the month. He used the word consequences, and he used more than once the name of a woman, Cora May Hadley. A widow, the man said, a widow with land of her own, 2 days' ride west, near Anaconda, a woman who had been alone since her husband's accident in the mines and who had, the man said, indicated she was willing to consider a new arrangement, but not, the man said carefully, with a daughter in the house. The wind moved the words around. Some of them were lost. Enough of them stayed. Etta stood with her back against the cold pine boards of the barn wall and the firewood in her arms, and she did not breathe. She felt the cold of the wood pass through her sleeves. She felt the cold of the air on her teeth. She felt her mother's death again, fresh as if it had only just happened, because in a way it had. Her mother had been the wall between her and what was coming. With the wall gone, what was coming was already in the room. She did not let them see her go in. She walked around the back of the barn and through the kitchen door and up to her room. She closed the door behind her and sat on her bed and put the wood down on the floor and did not light her lamp. She thought, "He will tell me when he is ready. He will give me time." She was wrong about that. He told her on a Tuesday morning 3 days later at the kitchen table. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the cup of coffee between his hands. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has already finished the conversation in his own head and is only now letting the words out. "I can't keep supporting you." She set down her spoon. "What? You're 18. You're old enough." The silence in the room was not silence. It was the wind in the chimney and the sound of the stove and her own breath and the soft tick of the clock on the mantel that had been her grandmother's. But underneath all of that, it was silence, the kind of silence a person hears once and remembers all their life. She waited. She thought he would say more. She thought there would be a reason given, an apology offered, some shape of words she could hold on to. There was none. "You'll have to figure things out," he said. He drank his coffee. She stood up. She picked up her bowl and her spoon, and she set them in the wash basin. She walked back upstairs without looking at him. She did not slam the door. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of her bed, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited for the shaking in her chest to stop. And when it did not stop, she let it shake, and she watched the window, and she counted her breaths, and she made a list inside her head of what she owned. It was a short list. She lay awake most of the night. She did not pack. She did not weep. She lay on her back with her hands folded over her ribs, and she stared at the pattern of the wallpaper in the small lamp she had finally lit, and she thought about the things her mother had taught her, and about the things her mother had not had time to teach her, and about which of the first set were going to have to do the work of the second set going forward on her own. She thought about money. She had a little. She had $9 and some coins she had saved from selling preserves in town. Her grandfather had once left her a tobacco tin with $14 in folded notes in it, which her mother had given to her when she turned 16 and had told her to keep for an emergency she could not yet imagine. The emergency had arrived. She had counted the money in the tin 3 times that summer, the way a person counts a thing she is not certain she will not need, and it had come each time to $14, $23. She thought about it. She thought about how far $23 would carry her. She thought about how much a hotel room cost, and a meal and a train ticket and a winter coat that fit, and she understood that the answer was not very far at all, and that she would have to make the money do other work than the work it had been minted for. She thought about where to go. South was Helena, and Helena was where the men her stepfather owed money to lived, and she had no business in any place where her name might be heard. East was the open country toward the Missouri. West was the Bitterroots. North was abandoned land, trapper country, forgotten towns, places where nobody asked questions and where in winter almost nobody came. She decided on North before the lamp burned out. The next morning her belongings were already outside the front door, set neatly on the porch, as if for a stagecoach. 1 wool blanket brown, mended twice at the corners, 2 changes of clothes folded, a pair of winter boots she had outgrown 2 years before and worn anyway, a small iron cooking pot dented on one side, a kerosene lantern with half a tin of oil, $23 in coins, and folded notes set inside a tobacco tin that had been her grandfather's, and on top of the pile, her mother's Bible. It was the Bible that did it. She had not seen him touch the Bible in 9 years of marriage. She had not seen him open it once. He must have gone into her mother's hope chest at the foot of the bed and taken it out and brought it down and set it there at the top of the stack, because he had known what it would mean to her, and he had wanted perhaps to make the cut clean, or perhaps he had wanted to be free of one more thing. She did not know. She did not ask. She picked up the Bible and she pressed it once against her chest, and she put it inside the blanket, and she rolled the blanket around her things, and she tied it tight with twine. She did not go back into the house. She walked off the porch and down the lane and out past the fence post where the lane met the road, and she turned north. No one came after her. No one called her back. By noon, the farmhouse was behind the rise of the first hill, and she could not see it anymore, and she did not look. She walked for 3 days through country she had never seen. The first night she slept in the loft of a barn outside a place called Avon. The farmer had not known she was there. She had slipped in after dark and slipped out before dawn, and she had left a single dime on a milk pail in payment for the straw, because her mother had taught her that what you take, you pay for, even if no one is watching. She woke that first morning with frost in her hair. The barn had been warmer than the open country, but it had not been warm. She had eaten a piece of dry bread she had bought the day before from a wayside store, and she had drunk water from the trough, where the horses drank, breaking the thin ice on top with the heel of her hand, and she had walked on. The country between Avon and the foothills of the range she was aiming for ran in long, low folds, alternating between open grass and stands of leafless cottonwood and aspen along the small creeks. The sky stayed gray. The wind came down from the north all morning and slackened around noon and rose again before sunset, and the cold rose with it. By the time she stopped for the night, the second night, she could no longer feel the small toe of her left foot. The second night was harder. She had stopped at a wayside lodge that advertised meals and a bed for 30 cents. The woman behind the counter had looked her over once slowly, the way a woman looks at another woman who has come in alone without a husband or a brother or a story that fits. The woman had not asked her age. The woman had asked her name. Etta had given a name that was not entirely her own, and the woman had heard the lie in it and had told her the lodge was full. The lodge was not full. There were 3 empty seats at the supper table behind her. Etta had nodded. She had said thank you. She had walked back out into the cold, and she had slept that night in a culvert under the road with her blanket pulled tight and her lantern out for fear of the oil. And she had not cried then either, because she had decided sometime around dusk that she was done crying for a while. She slept badly. She woke twice with the cold, and once with the sound of something moving in the brush nearby, and each time she lay perfectly still until the sound passed, or until her own shivering settled, whichever came first. Toward dawn, she did not so much sleep as drift, the way a body drifts when it is too tired to do otherwise, and when the first gray light came down the road, she got up and rolled her blanket and walked on, because walking was warmer than lying still. The third day she walked through a stretch of open country where the wind came down off the range with nothing in front of it but her, and where she passed a freight wagon coming the other way, and the driver of the wagon slowed his team and looked at her, and she felt his eyes go over her, the way the woman's had at the lodge, and she gripped the handle of her belt knife inside her coat pocket and kept walking. The wagon did not stop. The driver flicked his reins and the team went on. She did not look back until she had crossed 2 more hills. That was the kind of country she had walked into, a country that did not ask whose daughter you were, a country that did not much of the time ask anything at all. The dog found her on the fourth day. She had stopped at midday in the shelter of a windbreak of pines to rest her feet and to eat a piece of dry bread she had bought that morning at a wayside store. She had thought she was alone. She had been wrong. She heard a sound at the edge of the trees and looked up, and there it was, a dog, maybe a year old, maybe two, some kind of shepherd mix with a torn ear and a coat the color of wet bark and ribs you could count under the fur. It stood about 30 feet from her, and it did not come closer, and it did not run. She held out a piece of bread. It watched her. She set the bread down on the snow halfway between them, and she went back to her seat, and she did not look at the dog. After a long time she heard the soft crunch of footsteps and then the soft sound of an animal eating something it had not been sure it would be allowed to have. When she stood up to go, the dog was still there. It walked 3 paces behind her. She thought after about a mile that she should send it back. She thought after about 3 miles that she had nothing to send it back to. She thought after about 5 miles that it had probably been put out of a house too, and that 2 strays were not so different from 1 stray with company. She named it that night sitting beside a small fire under a rock overhang. She named it Patch because of the lighter spot of fur over its left eye, shaped roughly like a square. The dog did not seem to mind. In the long hours after dark before sleep came, she had lain on her back beside the small fire with the dog curled against her hip, and she had thought about her mother. She had thought about her mother in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up, kneading bread. She had thought about her mother in the garden weeding, between rows her hat pulled low against the sun. She had thought about her mother in the small bedroom at the end of the long upstairs hall on the last morning, with her hand growing slowly cold in her daughter's hand. She had thought about all of these things in turn, and she had not, while thinking of them, made any sound, although her chest had gone tight in places that had nothing to do with the cold. She had thought also about her uncle. She had not thought about her uncle in years. She had not, in fact, thought about him as a man at all. She had thought about him only as a sentence her mother had once said in the kitchen late on a winter evening when they had been kneading dough together. There had been a brother, her mother had said. He had gone west. He had not come back. Her mother had not said his name, and she had not said much more about him, and she had not the rest of that evening or any other brought him up again. Etta had not asked. She had been 12 years old. She had not understood then that some questions when asked do not bring an answer back so much as they take a piece of the person they have been asked of. She had only seen in her mother's face that the brother was a thing that hurt, and she had not having seen that wanted to make her mother hurt more, and so she had not asked. She wondered now, lying beside the small fire with the dog against her hip and the canyon country, still a full day's walk to the north, what her mother had not told her about her uncle. She wondered what his name had been. She thought she might have heard her mother say it once or twice very quietly on summer afternoons when she had been doing washing and had not known her daughter was within hearing. But she could not be sure. She had not been listening then in the way that would have let her remember. She closed her eyes. She slept. The first heavy snow came the next afternoon. Etta had been walking since dawn north along an old freight trail that climbed steadily into the foothills of the Bitterroots. She had expected another 2 days of fair weather. The clerk at the wayside store had said as much. The clerk was wrong. The clerk had not yet heard perhaps what the weatherman in Drummond had told the men at the general store the same morning. The storm was coming in early. The storm was coming in fast. The storm the weatherman had said was the kind of storm a man should not be caught out in. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had closed. By 3 o'clock, the wind had risen. By 4, she could no longer see the trail under her feet, and the world had become a wall of white, and the cold had begun to find the places in her clothes that her mother would have mended. She walked anyway. There was nothing else to do. The dog walked at her left side, head down. She could hear it breathing. The sound was a comfort she had not expected. It is a strange thing to be alone in a snowstorm with a dog you have known for one day, and to think of that dog as the one warm thing in your world. But that is what she thought. That is what carried her that afternoon the next 4 miles. She found the mouth of the canyon at dusk. It opened out of the side of the mountain like a wound that had been there a long time. 2 great walls of stone running back into the range, and a narrow stream cutting between them, and the snow piling up at its entrance in drifts that came to her knees. The canyon had a name. The old men in Drummond had called it Hollow Ridge. They had said no one went up there in winter. They had said the elk avoided it. They had said it was the kind of place a man could lose himself in and not be found until spring. She walked into it without slowing down. She had nowhere else to go. The dog hesitated at the entrance. Then it followed her. She made it about half a mile into the canyon before her legs would not carry her any farther. There was a great slab of granite leaning out from the eastern wall, forming an overhang deep enough to keep the snow out. She crawled under it. She unrolled her blanket. She lit her lantern with hands that no longer felt like hands. She fed the dog the last of her bread, and she put the lantern on a flat stone so the small heat of it would rise into the space under the slab, and she lay down with the dog against her side, and she pulled the blanket over both of them. She did not sleep. She did not really stay awake. She passed through a long gray country between the two for most of the night, and the wind outside, the overhang screamed in a voice she had never heard before, and the lantern guttered low, and the dog shivered against her, and once, sometime past midnight, she said out loud, "Mama," because she could not help it. But she lived through the night. Morning came slow. The wind had eased by sunup, but the air was colder than any air she had ever felt. The kind of cold that does not feel like cold. The kind that feels like nothing at all until you try to move your fingers and find that you cannot. She made herself move them anyway. She made herself sit up. She made herself eat a piece of dried meat she had been saving, and she gave half of it to the dog, and she stood up under the granite slab and looked out at the canyon in daylight for the first time. The canyon was beautiful. She did not want it to be beautiful. She wanted it to be only what it was, which was a place to die in if she did not find shelter. But it was beautiful anyway. The cliffs went up 200 feet on either side of her, layered in pale ochre and rust and deep gray, the colors of a country that had been there before there had been any name for it. The stream was a white ribbon of ice running through the middle. Pines clung to ledges high above their boughs, heavy with snow that fell in soft thumps as the morning sun touched them. She started to walk again. She did not know what she was looking for. A better overhang, maybe. A cave, even a shallow one. A windbreak that would keep her alive another night. She walked slowly with the dog at her side, and she ran one hand along the cliff wall as she went because the cliff was the only certain thing in the world, and her hand needed something to hold. She had walked perhaps 300 yards when she stopped. She did not know why at first. Her body had stopped before her mind had caught up. She stood with her hand on the cold stone and her breath coming out in a slow white plume, and she frowned and she waited. Then she felt it, a breath of warm air. It moved across the back of her gloved hand, and she pulled the glove off slow, as if the act might frighten the warmth away, and she held her bare hand out flat against the rock face. Warm. Not warm like a stove, not warm like skin, but warm, distinctly warm, the way a closed door feels warm when you put your hand on it from the cold side, and you know there is a fire on the other side of it. She stood for a long moment with her hand against the rock. Then she began to move along the wall, slowly, hand outstretched palm, reading the stone, the way her mother had once read the side of a kettle to know if it was ready. The warmth came and went. It strengthened. It faded. She tracked it the way a man tracks a trail in the woods, the way her mother had taught her, once to follow the wind in a pine forest when she had been a child and afraid. She walked 12 feet north. The warmth grew. She walked another 6. It grew stronger still. The dog behind her gave a low whine. She came around the shoulder of a great rock that bulged outward from the cliff face, and she stopped. There was ice here hanging in a frozen curtain from a small ledge above. The ice was thick and old, 2 seasons of it, maybe 3. Behind the ice was the cliff, and in the cliff behind the ice was a crack. It was narrow. A man would not have found it from any other angle. From straight on in poor light in the wrong season, the eye would have slid right past it, would have read it as one more line in the rust-colored stone. But she had felt it before she had seen it, and now that she had seen it, she could not unsee it. The warm air was coming out of the crack. She stood and stared at it for a long time. She thought, be careful. She thought, this is the kind of thing a person makes up in the cold. She thought, there is something here that does not belong to winter. Then she set down her bundle. She drew her belt knife. She chipped carefully at the lowest part of the ice curtain, and the ice came away in slow pieces. She worked for nearly an hour. The dog lay nearby watching. Her hands ached. Her shoulders ached. She did not stop. She had not had a reason to keep moving in 3 weeks, and she had one now, and her body did not seem to care anymore that it was tired. When the ice was gone, the crack stood open at its base, narrow at the top, wider at the bottom, just wide enough, perhaps, for a body to slip through sideways. She lit her lantern. She picked it up. She turned sideways. She put her shoulder into the dark. She pressed in. The dog did not follow at first. The dog stood at the opening and watched. Etta turned her head and made a small, soft sound, and the dog, after a moment, came after her. The crack ran 6 or 7 feet inward. The walls pressed at her chest and at her back. The lantern held out ahead of her through a small yellow eye of light onto the stone. The air around her got warmer, not hot, warmer, the way the air gets warmer as you come in from a porch into a kitchen. She came out of the crack into open space. She raised the lantern. She did not believe at first what the light showed her. The chamber was wide, wider than her stepfather's barn, higher than the ceiling of any room she had ever stood in. The lantern light reached up and was lost in the dark above her head. Stone walls curved gently outward and then back the shape of an enormous closed shell. The floor was uneven but mostly flat and dry. The air inside was perhaps 30 degrees warmer than the air she had stepped out of. Maybe more. She did not move. She listened. Somewhere deep in the rock very far away, there was a soft and steady sound, the kind a man hears at the bottom of a well. Water, running water somewhere beneath the stone. She did not know it then, but she would later come to understand it. A hot spring channeled through fissures in the bedrock, releasing its warmth slowly into the great chamber above. A natural furnace kindled long before any man had walked in this canyon. A miracle that was not a miracle, a piece of geology that had simply gone on being itself year after year, while the world above froze and thawed and froze again. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that she was standing in a place that should not exist, and that it was warm, and that she was not going to die that night. The dog came up beside her. It pressed its body against the back of her left knee. She felt the small, steady weight of it, and she put one hand down and rested it on the dog's head, and she felt her own legs begin finally to shake. She did not cry. She thought she might. She thought she had earned the right to, but she did not. The shake passed through her in slow waves and then quieted, and she stood in the lantern light and the warm air, and she said in a voice not much above a whisper, "All right." Then she walked forward. She walked carefully. She did not know what was on the floor. She kept the lantern low. She walked perhaps 15 feet and she stopped because the light had touched something that was not stone, wood. There was wood in the chamber. She crouched. She held the lantern out. It was a shelf, a long, narrow shelf, plank-built, fastened with iron pegs into the rock of the chamber wall. The wood was old. The wood was very old. It had once been pine and was now nearly black, and the pegs were rusted, and there was a layer of dust on the surface of the shelf, as fine as river silt and an inch deep in some places. But it was a shelf, a made thing, a thing built by hands. She stood up. She lifted the lantern higher. She saw the lantern then on the wall, an old kerosene lantern like hers, but heavier, hanging from a peg, driven into the stone above the shelf. The glass had cracked along one side. The metal was furred with rust. It had not been lit in a long time, a very long time. She saw the crates, 2 of them, wooden, broken, the slats sprung loose and lying on the floor beside them, the way crates fall apart over years when nothing is left inside to hold their shape. They were stacked against the far wall of the chamber in a corner where the light from her lantern barely reached, and they were the wreckage of someone's stores, someone's home. She had not been the first. She stood very still in the warm dark with the dog at her knee and the lantern in her hand, and she understood for the first time that she had walked into a place that had once belonged to another person, a man perhaps, or a woman, someone who had found the crack the way she had found it, someone who had carried wood through the narrow opening, someone who had built a life here, however brief, however strange, and then who had gone. She did not know where. She did not know when. She moved forward slowly, drawn by the lantern light and by something else, a feeling that ran underneath her ribs like a second heart. She walked past the shelf. She walked past the rusted lantern on its peg. She walked into the corner where the broken crates lay, and she crouched, and she lifted the lantern, and she swept its light across the dust of the floor. The light caught on something flat, something with a hard edge. She brushed the dust away with her bare hand. It was a trunk, a small iron-bound trunk the size of a child's sea chest set against the chamber wall behind the broken crates. The leather of its top was cracked and dry, but the iron of its bands was sound, and the lock plate was still in place. Someone had pushed it back into the corner and laid the crates against it, as if to hide it, or perhaps only as if to keep it out of the way. She knelt in front of it. The dog came up beside her and sat. She felt its breath warm against her arm. She lifted the lantern close. There were 2 letters cut into the leather of the trunk's lid. They had been carved, not burned. The carving had been done with care. She could see the marks of the knife in the slow curve of each line. She put her finger against the leather slow, the way she had touched her mother's hand at the very end, and she traced the letters, L.S. She did not move. She stared at the letters in the lantern light. She had been holding her breath. She did not know it until she let it out. The breath came out long and slow, and it shook in the warm cave air, and the dog beside her lifted its head and looked at her. L.S. She did not know yet what those letters were. She did not know that her mother had been born Delphine Sumner. She did not know, or had never thought about with any care, the brother her mother had once told her about one evening, years ago in the kitchen, while kneading dough, a brother who had gone west to look for ore, a brother who had not come home, a brother whose name had stopped being said in the house after the 2nd year because saying his name made her mother cry, and her mother had not been a woman who liked to cry in front of her child. She did not know any of that yet, but she sat in the warm dark in front of the trunk, and she pressed her hand against the carved letters, and a quiet thing moved through her, the kind of quiet that comes once or twice in a life, and that a person remembers afterward as the moment when one road ended and another began. She did not open the trunk that night. She tried the lock with the point of her belt knife and found it sound. The mechanism was old, but it had been built by a careful man. She could have forced it. She did not. Something in her did not want to force it. Something in her wanted to wait until she had earned the right to know what was inside, and she was not yet sure what right that would be or how she might earn it. She set the trunk back against the wall. She covered it again gently with the broken slats of the old crates the way she had found it. Then she stood up. She found a flat stretch of stone near the center of the chamber. She unrolled her blanket. She set the lantern down beside her. She gathered the few broken slats from the ruined crates and built a small fire, more out of habit than need, because the chamber did not need it, because the chamber was already warm. The fire caught quickly in the dry old wood. It burned with a clean orange light. It threw shadows up the curved walls of the chamber, large and slow. She sat by the fire. The dog curled against her hip. She ate a strip of dried meat. She gave a strip to the dog. She set the kettle from her pack on the edge of the fire, and she packed it with clean snow she had carried in on her boots, and she waited for the snow to melt, and she drank slowly the first warm water she had drunk in 8 days. She did not know what would come. She did not know about the man named Wendell Burrows, the lean, old trapper who would within the week follow the thin trail of her smoke to the canyon and stand outside the crack and stare at the cliff face and shake his head and say, "There isn't an inside." She did not know about the trapper's wife who would tell the story in town, or about the children who would laugh at the story, or about the men who would later ride north from Helena with a satchel full of forged papers, looking for a girl who did not yet know she was being looked for. She did not know about her stepfather either, who at that very moment was sitting at a table in Helena, losing the last of what he had ever owned, and who would one day, deep in a blizzard he did not see coming, find his way to a door he had once put a daughter out of, and would have to ask in a voice he did not yet have to be let inside. She did not know any of that. She only knew that for the first time in 3 weeks she was warm, that the dog beside her was warm, that her mother's Bible was inside her blanket roll against her left hip where she could feel it when she moved, that a small fire burned a few feet away, that deep beneath the chamber far below the stone of the floor water was running through old fissures and giving up its heat to the rock, and the rock was giving up its heat to the air, and the air was holding her up the way her mother had once held her up, the way the world sometimes did when it was about to ask a thing of you that you did not yet know how to give. She lay down. She rested her head on the rolled corner of the blanket. The dog put its head across her hip. The fire burned low. Outside, beyond the crack, beyond the ice curtain, she had broken open with her belt knife. Beyond the canyon and the wide white country and the foothills of the Bitterroots, the wind began to rise again and the snow began to come down again, and a winter the older men in Drummond would talk about for the rest of their lives began slowly to set its teeth. Inside, in the warm chamber, in the lantern light, in the breath of stone, Henrietta, Sumner closed her eyes. She slept. She slept the long, clean blackness, sleep of a body that has stopped expecting to wake up and has been told instead that it may live. She woke once deep in the night, and for a long moment she did not know where she was. The chamber was dark. The fire had burned down to a low ring of coals. The dog was breathing against her side slow, and even the breath of an animal that had decided in its own way that it had come home. She lay still and she listened. Somewhere in the stone beneath her, that distant water sound went on running, the way a heart goes on running, the way a thing that has been doing its work for 10,000 years does not stop because someone has come to listen. She thought of her mother. She thought of the kitchen and of the cough, and of the hand growing cold in her hand. She thought of the letters carved into the lid of the trunk. L.S. She did not know what they meant, but she knew that they meant something. She knew it the way a body knows when the weather is about to change. She knew it the way a child knows before she has been told that something in the house has shifted, that her mother has been crying in the next room, that the world she had thought was one shape has begun to be another shape. She closed her eyes again. She slept. And somewhere deep in the dark of the mountain, the water kept running the way it had run for the man who had carved his initials into the lid of a small iron-bound trunk and had then walked out into a daylight he did not come home from. The water kept running, the chamber stayed warm, and the first night in the warm wall of Hollow Ridge ended the way all first nights end, with the sleeper not yet knowing what had begun. She woke to the smell of stone. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of a deep place that had been undisturbed for a long time, a smell with no rot in it, no damp, no animal, only the clean, cold mineral breath of the mountain mixed faintly with the lingering smoke of the fire that had burned down to ash beside her in the night. For a long moment she did not move. She lay on the rolled blanket with her cheek against her own forearm, and she listened and she felt the warm air move against her face, and she remembered slowly where she was. The dog was already awake. It sat up beside her, watching her face the way a dog watches the face of the one person in the world who has not yet sent it away. Its torn ear twitched. Its eyes were quiet. Henrietta Sumner sat up. She looked at the chamber in the gray light that came in through the crack. It was a different chamber than the one she had walked into the night before. Lantern light had made it small and golden a room. Daylight made it larger. She could see now the high curve of the ceiling, the way the stone went up in a long, uneven arc, the deep shadows where the light did not reach, the shelf on the wall, the rusted lantern on its peg, the broken crates in the corner, the trunk behind them covered again with the slats she had laid back across it. LS. The letters were still there behind the wood. She could feel them even from where she sat, the way a person can feel a closed door in a quiet house. She stood up. She rolled her blanket. She fed the dog the last strip of dried meat. She drank the cold remainder of the water from her kettle. She had work to do, and she had decided in the night in some part of herself she had not yet been able to name that she would do it before she opened the trunk, that she would earn the right to look inside. She did not yet know what the work was. She only knew it was hers. The first 3 days she did not stop moving. She gathered the broken slats from the old crates and stacked them carefully against the wall by size, the way her mother had stacked kindling on the back porch in the autumn. She cleared the dust from the long plank shelf with a folded square of cloth and found that the wood beneath was sound. She walked the chamber slow, with the lantern marking the places where the floor was uneven and the places where it was not, finding a low, natural shelf of stone where she could keep her cooking pot, finding a corner where the air seemed to move out instead of in a kind of natural chimney that would take her fire smoke up and away through some fissure she could not see. She tested the chimney with a small fire of split slat wood. The smoke went up and was gone. She nodded to herself alone in the chamber, and the dog watched her, and she said, "Good." It was the first word she had spoken aloud in 2 days. She went out that afternoon to look at the canyon. The storm of the night before had stopped, but the cold had not. The sky over Hollow Ridge was the hard pale blue of midwinter, and the air bit at her face like something with teeth. She stood at the mouth of the crack and pulled the wool wrap up over her mouth and squinted out at the white world. The stream below was a sheet of ice. The pines on the far cliff were heavy with snow, and as she watched one shed its load in a slow, soft thump that echoed up the canyon walls, she went down to the stream. She broke the ice with the back of her knife and drew water in her pot. She filled her arms with deadfall pine. She found along the bank dry as bone, perfect for burning. She climbed back up to the crack with the wood in her arms and the dog walking 3 paces behind her, and she squeezed sideways through the opening, and she came again into the warm chamber, and she set the wood down against the wall. That night she ate a thin soup of melted snow and salted pork, and she sat by her small, clean fire, and she looked at the broken crates in the corner. She did not open the trunk, not yet. The work was not done. On the 4th day she began on the shelf. She had brought no tools with her except for her belt knife and a small hand hatchet she had carried for kindling, but the broken slats of the old crates were a kind of tool in themselves, and she set to making them into things. She pulled the rusted iron pegs out of the wood with the back of her hatchet. She straightened them between two stones. She rebuilt the long plank shelf where it had sagged, knocking the iron pegs back through the wood and into the soft cracks in the stone where they had first been set 20 years before by hands she did not know. She rebuilt the broken crates into a low sleeping platform along the eastern wall of the chamber. She lifted her blanket onto it. She lifted her mother's Bible onto it and laid it square on the corner, and she stood looking at it for a long while. She built shelves above her sleeping platform. She built a small frame beside the fire pit where she could hang her cooking pot. She found deep in the back of the chamber a place where the rock floor sank gently into a natural basin, and she carried snow in by the armful and set the basin to filling so that when the snow melted, she would have water always close at hand. The work warmed her. The work emptied her. The work gave her hands a thing to do that her mind did not have to follow. On the 5th day, she found a second small chamber off the main one. She had been moving slowly along the back wall with her lantern looking for any other openings, any other surprises the chamber might be holding back, when her light had fallen across a narrow gap between two folds of stone that she had not seen before. The gap was not wide enough for a person, but the lantern light went into it, and there was darkness on the other side. She had set the lantern down and gone in sideways. She had come out into a smaller room, perhaps 15 feet across, lower ceilinged, drier still, and entirely empty. She had stood in the small room and turned slowly with the lantern, and she had understood after a moment what it was. It was a storeroom, or it had been meant to be one. There were no shelves, there were no crates, there were no marks on the walls, but the floor of it had been smoothed in places the way a man smooths a floor when he means to put things on it, and there was at the back of the small room a flat shelf of natural stone at about waist-height level as a tabletop that could only have been worked toward that shape with some intent. The man who had used the main chamber, she understood, had been building. He had been making a place. He had not finished. She went back into the main chamber. She sat down on her sleeping platform. She put her hand against the back wall of the chamber the way a person puts a hand against a thing that has just shown her something about itself, and she let her breath out slow, and she did not say anything for a while. On the 6th day, she opened the trunk. She did not do it in any ceremony. She did not light extra lanterns or kneel in front of it the way a person might in a story. She simply finished sweeping the back corner with a folded square of canvas, and she stood up, and she looked at the trunk, and she thought, "It is time." She pulled the slats away. She knelt. She took her belt knife from her hip. The lock was old. She had been right about the careful man who had made it. The mechanism was simple but tight, and it took her some minutes with the point of the knife pressing and feeling before she heard the slow, soft click of a catch giving way. She set the knife aside. She lifted the lid. The smell came up at her faint dry, the smell of old paper and old leather and old oiled steel. There were 3 things inside: a book wrapped in oilcloth set on the top, a folded square of paper beneath the book, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of rough flannel, the dull, heavy weight of a small object she could not see. She lifted the book out first. She set it on her knees. She unwrapped the oilcloth with hands she could not for some reason keep entirely steady. The book inside was bound in brown calf leather, soft, with use the corners worn to a pale tan. There was no title on the cover. There was no name on the spine. She opened it. The first page was blank. The second was not. The hand was a man's hand, steady, slightly slanted, the kind of writing that comes from a man who has learned to write but has not had to do much of it. The ink was brown with age. The first line at the top of the page was a date, May 4th, 1879. Below it 2 more words, I begin. She turned the page. She read for a long time. It was a journal. The man who had written it had begun it on a spring day in 1879. He had been a miner. He had come north out of Helena that spring with a small grubstake and a single-pack mule and a long-handled hammer, and he had ridden up into the Bitterroots looking for a thing he had been told about by a man in a saloon, a thing the man in the saloon had not himself been brave enough to go and look for. A vein of ore, the man in the saloon had said, high up, deep in a canyon they called Hollow Ridge. The miner had gone to look. The miner had found something. He did not say at first in the journal what he had found. He was a careful man. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about the mule whose name was Hannibal. He wrote about the canyon, which he described with a precision that made her sit forward as she read. He wrote about the cliff. He wrote on the page dated June 12th, 1879, about the warm air that had brushed his face one afternoon when he had been resting in the shadow of the eastern wall. He had found the crack 2 days later. He had found the chamber the day after that. She closed the book. She sat in the warm chamber with the journal on her knees and the dog at her side, and she stared at the cracked leather cover, and she felt a thing move slowly through her chest that did not have a name. The man who had written this book had stood where she had stood. The man who had written this book had felt the warm air with his bare hand the way she had felt it. The man who had written this book had walked through the crack with a lantern in his hand the way she had walked, and he had stood in the dark and raised his lantern the way she had raised hers. She opened the journal again. She turned the pages slowly. He had built the shelf she had rebuilt. He had built the crates she had broken down for her sleeping platform. He had carried his food and his tools and his blankets and his lantern up through the crack the way she had carried hers. He had lived in this chamber for the better part of 2 summers and 1 winter, and he had written in his careful slanted hand about each one. He had not been alone in the world. He had a sister. He spoke of her often. He had not seen her in 3 years, he wrote, but he intended to. He missed her. He worried about her. She had married against her wishes, a man their father had chosen, and the miner did not entirely trust that man, and he had said so in plain language on the page, dated August 21st, 1879. The sister's name was given only once in the early pages, the way a man writes the name of a person he thinks of so often he barely needs to write it. Her sister's name was Delphine. Henrietta closed the book. She closed it slowly with both hands, and she set it down on the floor of the chamber beside her knee. She did not move. The dog looked up at her. The dog, in the way of dogs, did not understand what had happened, but understood that something had happened. It pressed its body against her hip and waited. Delphine. Delphine had been her mother's name. Delphine Sumner, of the Drummond Sumners, married first to a man named James Halloran, who had died of a fever when Etta was 3 years old, married after that to Theron Doyle, daughter before all of it of a man named Ellis Sumner, who had owned a small dry goods store south of Drummond, and who had died. Etta had been told once of his heart on a winter night when her mother had still been a young woman. Etta herself had grown up under the Sumner name. Her mother had taken the name back in the years after James Halloran's death, partly because James had left no family to speak of, and partly because the small homestead she had inherited from her own father had been deeded in the name of Sumner, and a widow in that country, with a child to raise and a piece of land to hold, did not lightly give up the name on the deed. When she had married Theron Doyle 6 years later, she had kept the Sumner name in everyday use for herself and for her daughter, and Theron, who had not been a man to fight over small things, had not made an issue of it. Etta had been Henrietta Sumner, since the day she could write her name, and the name had stayed. Delphine had had a brother. Etta sat in the warm dark of the chamber, and she remembered slowly the way a person remembers a dream from years ago, the 1 or 2 times her mother had mentioned him, a brother who had gone west to look for ore, a brother who had not come home, a brother whose name had not been said in the house after the 2nd year because saying it made her mother weep, and her mother had not been a woman who liked to weep in front of her child. Lemuel. The brother's name had been Lemuel. She picked up the journal again. She turned the cover. She looked at the inside of the leather where a man sometimes writes his name, and there it was, in the same careful hand on the inside of the front board, Lemuel Sumner, his own. She lifted the second thing from the trunk, the folded square of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a map hand-drawn in the same brown ink as the journal, and it showed the canyon and the position of the crack and a line that went back from the chamber into the deeper rock, and at the end of the line an X, and beside the X a single word, vein. She set the map down. She lifted the last thing from the trunk, the flannel-wrapped weight. She unwrapped it on her knees. It was a piece of stone about the size of a man's fist, gray and heavy, and through it in long bright threads ran a metal she did not at first recognize. Then she did. She had seen smaller pieces of it once in a store window in Drummond behind glass with a placard beside it. The placard had read "Native Gold." She held the stone in her hand. It was cold. It was heavy. It was in every way she could measure it, only a stone. But it was also, she understood, the reason her uncle had not come home. She wrapped it again in the flannel. She set it back in the trunk. She set the map back on top of it. She did not put the journal back. She kept the journal. She carried it across the chamber to her sleeping platform, and she set it beside her mother's Bible, and she sat down on the platform, and she put her hands in her lap, and she looked at the 2 books side by side, and she did not cry. The tears had been pulled out of her somewhere on the trail and had not yet come back. She sat for a long time, and the dog came up onto the platform beside her and lay across her feet, and the chamber stayed warm, and the lantern burned low and steady, and the day passed. She read the journal through that night from beginning to end. He had been 41 years old. He had been writing to himself in part, and in part she realized, as she read, he had been writing to her mother. There were passages addressed openly to Delphine, long passages, sometimes a whole page. He had told her about the chamber. He had told her about the vein. He had told her he meant to file his claim properly with the land office in Helena before the next winter set in, and that he meant after that to ride east and find her and to bring her home from the man their father had married her to, and to set her up in a house of her own with whatever else she might need for as long as she might need it. He had not done any of those things. The last entry in the journal was dated October 9th, 1879. He had been on his way down out of the canyon. He had been carrying the stone and the map and his journal in a pack on his shoulder. He had meant, he wrote in that last entry, to ride into Drummond the next morning to put the journal and the map and the sample into the hands of the man at the bank with instructions to hold them for his sister in the event he did not return. He had been thinking even then about what could happen. He had been thinking about the man in the saloon. He had not in the journal written what happened next. The last entry ended in the middle of a sentence. She closed the book softly. She understood in a way she could not have understood before that night why the trunk had been pushed back into the corner of the chamber and the crates piled in front of it. He had not been hiding it from a thief. He had been hiding it from the weather. He had been coming back. He had not been coming back to live in this chamber. He had been coming back to take the trunk down to Drummond, to put it in the hands of the man at the bank, to make sure that if anything happened to him between here and Helena, his sister would have what was hers. He had not made it. Something had happened to him on the trail. Etta sat in the warm dark, and she thought about her mother. She thought about the years her mother had lived in the farmhouse south of Drummond, working her hands raw, raising a daughter, never knowing that her brother had not, in the end, abandoned her, never knowing that he had been on his way back, never knowing that there was a place high up in the Bitterroots that had been, in some sense, she could not have imagined already hers. Etta thought, "This is mine." She did not think it with greed. She thought it the way a person thinks. This is the chair my grandmother sat in. This is the table she mended at. This is the place I came from, even though I did not know it. She thought it as a thing about her family, and she felt sitting there in the lantern light with the journal closed on her knee, the first true ground beneath her feet that she had felt since the morning her mother had died. She lay down on her sleeping platform. She put the journal under her blanket beside the Bible. She slept. The man came on a Tuesday. She had been in the chamber for 10 days by then. She had a routine. She rose early. She went out to the stream for water. She gathered deadfall along the bank. She kept her fire small and clean. She had taken to going up onto a high ledge in the eastern wall of the canyon in the afternoons, where the sun came in at a long slant for about an hour, and where she could sit with the dog beside her and watch the canyon and think. She was sitting on that ledge when she saw the figure in the snow. It was a long way off. A man on foot coming up the canyon from the south with a long rifle held across his arms and a pack on his back, and the slow, steady stride of a man who had walked for a living his whole life. He stopped twice on his way up the canyon to look at the cliff face. He stopped a third time at a place where she realized, with a small, cold tightening of her stomach, the thin trail of her morning smoke might still have hung in the air an hour before. She watched him come. She did not go down at first. She wanted to see what he would do. He stopped about 50 yards short of the crack. He stood very still. He looked at the cliff. He shaded his eyes against the snow glare, and he looked at the cliff for a long time. Then he walked closer, slow, the way a careful man walks, and he stopped again about 10 feet from the crack, and he stood there with his rifle held easy across his arms and his head tilted slightly to one side, and she saw even from the ledge above him the small, slow shake of his head. She came down off the ledge. She came down quietly. The dog came with her. She crossed the floor of the canyon to where the man was standing with the rifle across his arms, looking at the cliff. He heard her come. He turned. He did not raise the rifle. He looked at her for a long moment and at the dog, and then back at her, and he said in a voice that had spent more years out of doors than in, "Where did you come from?" She tilted her head. "Inside," she said. He looked at the cliff. He looked at her. He looked at the cliff again. "There isn't an inside," he said. She raised one finger and pointed to the dark place behind the broken ice curtain. He squinted. He stepped closer. He saw the crack. He turned and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Go on," she said. "Look." He laid his rifle down carefully on a flat stone. He shrugged out of his pack. He stepped to the crack. He turned sideways. He put his shoulder in. He was gone perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. When he came back out, he stood for a long moment in the snow with his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking at the cliff. Then he looked at her. He was a lean old man, maybe 65, with a face like a piece of weathered cedar, and eyes the pale brown color of creek water. He did not in his face look like a man surprised by much, but there was something in his face now that looked like a man who has just been shown a thing he did not expect to be shown. "No," he said. She almost smiled. "No what?" He pointed at the cliff. "There's a house in there." "Pretty much," she said. He turned slowly and looked at her. He shook his head once. "What's your name?" he said. "Etta Sumner." "Wendell Burrows," he said. He did not offer his hand. He nodded at the dog. "Yours?" "Patch." He looked at the dog. "Looks like he found you." He did. Wendell Burrows took his pipe out of his coat pocket. He did not light it. He set the stem of it between his teeth and stood there a moment looking at her. He looked at her clothes, he looked at her boots, he looked at her face, she understood at all the things a man looks at when he is trying to decide what kind of person he has just met. "How long you been up here?" he said. 10 days. "By yourself?" "By myself." He chewed on the pipe stem. He looked at the cliff again. "Well," he said, "that's something." He stayed for an hour. He did not come into the chamber. She did not ask him to. They stood in the snow at the mouth of the crack, and he asked her a few quiet questions, the way an old man who has lived a long time and learned that questions are best asked carefully will ask them. She told him she was from south of Drummond. She told him her mother had died the year before. She did not tell him about her stepfather. He did not press her on it. He looked at her once when she did not answer, and his eyes moved a little, and then he nodded, and he went on to other questions. He had been trapping the upper bitter roots for 40 years, he said. He had not known there was a chamber in this cliff. He had walked past this crack, he said, more times than he could count. "Most people would," she said. "Yes," he said, "most people would." He spoke after a while about his own life. He spoke about it slowly and without much detail, the way old men who have lived alone for a long time will speak about themselves when they speak at all. He had been married once. His wife had died in childbirth 27 winters ago in a cabin not far from here. The child had died with her. He had buried them on the same morning on a hill he could still see from his cabin door, and he had not, in the years since, lived in any town for longer than the few days it took him to sell furs and buy supplies. He had a brother in Spokane. He had a niece somewhere east. He did not write letters because his hand had never been a good one for that kind of work, and because he said, "The people you write to are mostly people you would rather see," and Spokane was a long ride. He did not say any of this in a tone that asked for sympathy. He said it the way a man reports the weather. He had said it perhaps because Etta had not asked him anything, and silence between two people who do not know each other will eventually find its own way of being filled. Before he went, he gave her 2 things. He gave her a small twist of paper containing tea leaves, and he gave her a piece of advice. "There's talk in town," he said. "What kind of talk?" "About a girl living in a cliff." She looked at him. "I heard it 3 days ago," he said, "from a man who heard it from a man who heard it from a freighter. Talk like that spreads. Talk like that draws people." She nodded slowly. "I'm not telling you to leave," Wendell Burroughs said. "I wouldn't tell you that. I'm telling you to watch the road." "I will." He nodded. He picked up his pack. He picked up his rifle. He looked at her one more time. "You don't talk much," he said. "No," she said. He almost smiled. He didn't quite. "I'll come back," he said. "All right." He walked back down the canyon the way he had come. She watched him until he was out of sight around the southern bend. Then she went back into the chamber, and she sat on her sleeping platform with the dog across her knees, and she thought for a long while about what he had said. Talk like that draws people. She thought about the trunk in the corner. She thought about the journal under her blanket. She thought about the small, heavy piece of gold-veined stone wrapped in flannel. She thought for the first time since she had come into the chamber that she might need to be more careful than she had been. That night, she did 3 things. She took the journal out from under her blanket, and she wrapped it again in its oilcloth, and she set it back inside the trunk beside the flannel-wrapped stone and the folded map. She locked the trunk with the key she had found inside its mechanism, and she put the key on a length of twine, and she put the twine around her own neck. She would not, after that night, take it off. She pulled the trunk out from behind the broken crates. She moved it to the head of her sleeping platform, where she could see it from where she lay, and where any person coming through the crack would have to step past her before they could reach it. And she sat for a long time after that with her back against the wall of the chamber and her hand on the lid of the trunk, and she thought the way her mother had taught her to think when there was a hard thing in front of her about what she would do. She thought about the law. She had not until that night thought about the law as a thing that might be on her side. The law had always been a thing other people had, and that came down on her people in unfortunate ways, the way it had come down on her mother once when the bank had taken a piece of her father's old land, and the way it had come down on a neighbor woman who had not been able to keep her house after her husband ran off, and the way it had come down more vaguely on her own life in the form of an eviction from a porch she had been born into. But the law, she thought, could also be a wall. The journal in the trunk, she thought, could become a wall. She would need help, she thought. She would need a lawyer. She did not know any lawyers. She had $22 left, and she did not know what a lawyer cost. She did not know how to find one. She did not know even what to ask one for. But she thought she could find out. She thought she could walk into Drummond, 11 miles south, and she could ask, and she could pay $1, perhaps $2, and she could learn what the words were that the law used for what had happened to her uncle and for what was hers, and for how a person who held something that had been left to her by blood could keep it. She decided that she would go. She did not that night decide when. She slept. The town of Drummond had laughed at her by then. Wendell Burroughs had not lied to her about that. The story had begun the week before, when an itinerant peddler had ridden through and told a tale at the bar of the Stockman's Rest about a girl he had passed on the trail north of Avon, a girl with a wool blanket and a yellow dog and a face like she had walked out of a winter she had not yet stopped walking through. The peddler had said he heard later from a freighter that a girl matching that description had been seen up near Hollow Ridge. The freighter had said he heard from a hunter that a girl up there had built herself a house inside a cliff. The men at the bar had laughed. The story had not stopped at the bar. It had gone home with the men. It had gone the next morning to the kitchen tables and the back porches and the post office steps. A girl living inside a mountain. A girl married, some said, to a mountain spirit. A girl who had found a magic cave and was hiding from a sheriff. A girl, the boldest of them suggested, who did not exist at all and had been made up by the freighter to get a drink out of a peddler. The story spread the way such stories spread. She did not hear it, not directly. She was not in town. She did not see the men nudging each other in the post office line. She did not hear the small, mean laughter of the older women at the church social. She did not know any of that. But she could feel somehow in the slow days that followed Wendell Burroughs's first visit that something in the air around her had begun to gather. She felt it most of all on the day the wind changed. It had been a cold week, but the cold had been a steady cold, a winter cold, the kind a country knows how to hold. On the morning of the day the wind changed, Etta walked out of the crack and felt the air against her face and stopped. The air was different. It was not warmer. It was not colder. It was different. The kind of difference a person who has lived in country weather all her life can feel without being able to say what it is. The wind had shifted around to the north and had a smell to it she did not like, a smell like iron, a smell like a storm that had not yet started but had decided where it was going to go. She stood for a long moment in the mouth of the canyon. She looked at the sky. The sky did not look like a storm sky. The sky looked, in fact, perfectly clear, a high pale blue with thin white streaks of cirrus far up, but the wind knew something the sky did not yet show. She turned and went back inside. 2 days later, Wendell Burroughs came back, and this time he was not alone. He brought with him an older man on a tired bay horse and a paper folded inside the man's coat pocket. The older man was named Ambrose Sinclair. He was a slight gray-bearded man of perhaps 55 in a long traveling coat that had seen too many winters and a wide-brimmed hat pulled down against the sun. He had a quiet, careful manner, and he carried in a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, an instrument she had only ever seen drawings of, a brass barometer in a wooden case. He had ridden up from Drummond. Wendell said the night before, "What's he doing up here?" Etta said low when Wendell came to her by the mouth of the crack. "Telling you what's coming," Wendell said. Ambrose Sinclair came forward. He looked at her with the careful, almost shy attention of a man who has spent more of his life with instruments than with people. He raised his hat. He set it back on his head. He said in a soft voice that had a kind of educated rhythm to it she had not heard much of, "Miss Sumner, Mr. Burroughs tells me you are living up here." "I am." "How well are you provisioned?" She thought about it. "Enough," she said, "for a week. More than that." "For two." She paused. She looked at him. "Why?" Ambrose Sinclair tilted his head toward the south. "The stations at Missoula and at Helena have been sending reports for 5 days," he said. "There is a storm moving down out of Canada. It has been gathering on the eastern slope. The barometers are dropping faster than I have seen them drop in 20 years of taking readings." He paused. "It is going to be the worst winter system in decades," he said. He said it quietly. He said it the way a doctor tells a family a thing that has already been decided. He looked at her, and he looked at Wendell, and he looked back at her. "I do not know," he said, "how long it will last. I do not know how cold it will be at the worst of it. I know only that it is coming, and that it is coming fast, and that anyone who can be inside should be inside." Etta looked at the cliff behind her. "I will be inside," she said. Wendell Burroughs gave a small nod, the kind of nod a man gives when a person has confirmed something he had already known. Ambrose Sinclair did not nod. He looked at her a moment longer with that careful instrument reader's attention, and then he said, "Miss Sumner, there is one other thing." "What?" "A man came in on the stage yesterday from Helena," he said. "He was asking at the bar of the Stockman's Rest about a girl in a canyon." Etta's stomach went cold. "What kind of man?" she said. "A well-dressed man," Ambrose Sinclair said. "A lawyer by his manner, or a man trying to look like one. He carried a leather case. He said he represented an estate. He said the estate was that of a man named Sumner." The cold in her stomach did not go away. "What was his name?" she said. "Jasper Vane," Ambrose Sinclair said. She did not know the name. She had never heard it in her life, but she knew the way a person knows in the bones that a name they have never heard belongs to a man who has been thinking about them. Wendell Burroughs spoke up then, soft, the way he had spoken to her the first time he had warned her about the talk in town. "He has been asking after the canyon," Wendell said. "He has been asking by name after Hollow Ridge." Etta stood for a long moment in the snow. She looked at the two men. She looked at the cliff. She looked back at the two men. "What does he want?" she said, although she already knew. Ambrose Sinclair did not answer at first. He looked at Wendell. Wendell looked at Etta. He says Wendell said slow that he is the rightful heir to a claim filed in this canyon in the year 1879. He says he has the papers to prove it. He says the girl in the cliff is in unlawful possession of land that belongs to him. The wind moved across the mouth of the canyon. It came down off the high country with that thin iron smell on it, and it moved her wool wrap against her cheek, and somewhere up the canyon, the dog gave a low, warning growl, the way a dog will growl at a thing it has not yet seen, but has begun to suspect is coming. Henrietta Sumner stood in the snow at the mouth of the crack. She stood very still. She looked in the gathering afternoon at the two men who had ridden up to warn her. Then she said quietly, "He is lying." Wendell Burroughs nodded. "I figured," he said. "The claim is mine," she said. Wendell Burroughs nodded again slow. "I figured that too," he said. Ambrose Sinclair looked between them. He did not understand yet. He had been told only what the man in the bar had said. He was a careful man, and he did not ask. He looked at Etta with that gentle instrument reader's attention, and he waited. She did not tell him yet about the journal. She did not tell him about the trunk. She did not tell him about the brother her mother had, the man named Lemuel Sumner, who had been on his way down out of the canyon in October of 1879 with a piece of gold-veined stone in his pack and a journal in his coat and the intention in his heart of riding east to find her. She did not tell anyone yet, but she stood in the snow at the mouth of the warm wall of Hollow Ridge, and she felt the iron-smelling wind on her face, and she understood with the clarity of a thing that had been moving toward her since the morning her mother had died, and which had now finally come into view, that she had been put out of a house in November, and that she had walked north for 3 weeks in a winter that had come early, and that she had felt warm air against the side of her face in a canyon nobody else came to, and that the warm air had led her to the only place in the world that had ever truly belonged to her family, and that she was not going to be made to leave it. Not by a storm, not by a man with forged papers, not by anyone. She looked at Wendell Burroughs. She looked at Ambrose Sinclair. She said, "Thank you both for coming up. I am going to need a moment to think." "Take it," Wendell said. She turned. She walked past them, past her dog, who had been standing at her left knee the whole time, and she walked to the crack in the cliff, and she squeezed sideways through it, and she came again into the warm dark of the chamber, and she stood inside alone with the dog at her side, and she let the warm air of the mountain move against her face. She had thought when she had come in here 10 days before that she had only been looking for shelter. She understood now that she had walked into a thing larger than shelter. She walked to the back of the chamber. She crouched. She lifted the slats away from where she had once kept the trunk. The trunk was no longer there. She had moved it. She had moved it to the head of her sleeping platform, where it sat now behind her with the iron key on a twine around her neck. She put her hand against the cold stone where the trunk had been, and she said soft in the warm dark, almost as if to him, "I will hold it. Whatever it costs me, I will hold it." The dog sat beside her in the lantern light. Outside, far down the canyon, the iron-smelling wind began to rise. The storm of the century was 3 days out, and a man with forged papers was riding north out of Helena and somewhere south of Drummond. A stepfather she had not seen in 3 weeks was losing the last of his money to a hand of cards he should not have stayed in for, and the journal of a long-dead uncle lay locked inside the trunk at the head of a sleeping platform she had built herself. And Henrietta Sumner, 18 years old, alone in a warm chamber in the wall of a frozen canyon, set her hand against the cold stone where the trunk had been, and she did not move it for a long time. Outside, just past the mouth of the canyon, where the snow lay deep and the pines stood quiet, Wendell Burroughs and Ambrose Sinclair stood waiting in the cold. Neither of them spoke. They knew in the way that older men know that what they had carried up the canyon they had now delivered, and that what came next would not be theirs to decide. A single soft sound far off rose from somewhere deep in the high country, the first low note of the wind that would by week's end become a wall. The two men listened. The dog at the mouth of the crack lifted its head, and inside the warm wall of Hollow Ridge in the lantern light, with her hand on the wall of her uncle's chamber and her mother's Bible on the platform behind her, and the long story of her family closing slowly around her like a hand closing around a coin, Henrietta Sumner began to plan. The storm came on a Thursday. It did not announce itself. It did not roll in slow the way summer weather rolls in, with thunderheads building on the horizon for a man to watch. It came down out of the high country in the dark hours before dawn, and Henrietta Sumner woke to a sound she had never heard before. It was the sound of the canyon breathing. She lay on her sleeping platform in the warm dark, and she listened. The dog beside her had lifted its head. Its ears were forward. Somewhere far up the canyon, far above the chamber, the wind was moving through the high cliffs in a long, sustained, hollow note, the way a man might blow across the mouth of a great stone jug, and the note was not stopping. It rose. It deepened. It became, as she lay there, a low, continuous roar. She sat up slowly. She lit the lantern. She walked to the crack and put her shoulder against the stone and looked out. The world had gone white. There was no canyon anymore. There were no cliffs. There was no stream. There was only a wall of snow moving sideways through a darkness that should have been dawn, and somewhere in the wall of snow, the wind was screaming in a voice she did not recognize. The world had been replaced by weather. The mountain had drawn a sheet across itself and was not letting anything in or out. She stepped back into the warm chamber. She stood for a long moment in the lantern light. Then she set the lantern on the shelf and she went to work. She had been preparing for 3 days. After Ambrose Sinclair and Wendell Burroughs had ridden back down out of the canyon with their warning, she had made a list inside her head, the way her mother had taught her to make lists, and she had begun to work through it. She had carried in more wood. She had carried in more snow in armfuls until the natural basin at the back of the chamber held enough water for a small ocean. She had pulled the trunk out from behind the broken crates, and she had moved it to the head of her sleeping platform where she could see it and where no one else who might come through the crack could see it first. She had also done one more thing. She had walked the day before the storm came down to Drummond. She had gone alone. Wendell Burroughs had offered to ride with her. She had said no. She had said it was a thing she needed to do without a witness, and the old trapper had looked at her once, the way he sometimes looked at her, and he had not asked her any more about it. She had walked the 11 miles into town with Patch at her side, and she had gone first to the office of a lawyer named Cyrus Calloway, whose name she had heard once from a man at a wayside store. Cyrus Calloway was a small, neat man with white side whiskers and a careful manner, and he had listened to her for nearly an hour without interrupting. She had told him about the journal. She had told him about the trunk. She had told him about her uncle Lemuel Sumner and the year 1879 and the brother her mother had had and the brother who had not come home. She had not shown him the journal. She had not shown him the map. She had not, for that matter, told him about the piece of gold-veined stone. She had simply told him the facts, and she had asked him a question. If a man filed a claim in 1879, she had said, and that man never came back to it, and the claim has been sitting unworked for 20 years, and a man comes now and says he is the heir of the original filer, but the heir of the original filer is in fact his own niece by blood, and the niece is here, and she has her uncle's own writing in her own hands, and his sister was her mother, and the daughter of the sister stands in front of you. Now what does the law say? The lawyer had taken off his spectacles. He had polished them slow on the lapel of his coat. He had put them back on his face. The law says, Miss, he had said, that the daughter of the only sister of the original filer is the rightful heir, provided she can prove the relation and provided the original filing can be confirmed at the land office in Helena. How do I prove the relation? She had said. You bring me your mother's marriage record. You bring me your own birth record. You bring me anything in your uncle's own hand, dated that names your mother as his sister. She had thought for a moment. What if I could bring all three? She had said. The lawyer had looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. Then, miss, he had said quietly, I would advise you that we have a case. She had nodded. She had stood up. She had paid him $1 for his time out of the 23 she had carried out of her stepfather's house, and she had walked back to the chamber in Hollow Ridge with the dog at her side, and she had not spoken to another living soul for the rest of that day. She had gone on the same trip down to Drummond to the office of the county clerk. She had paid another 15 cents for a copy of her mother's first marriage record, which had named Delphine Sumner of Drummond and James Halloran of Avon, and the date and the witnesses. She had paid another 10 cents for her own birth record, which had named Delphine Sumner Halloran as her mother. She had folded these papers carefully, and she had put them inside her mother's Bible between the leaves of the book of Ruth, and she had walked home. She had not told Wendell Burrows about any of it. She had not told Ambrose Sinclair either. That was the work she had done. Now the storm had come. She stood in the lantern light and she did the small, steady things a person does at the start of a long siege. She set her cooking pot on its hook. She filled it with snow from the basin. She built her fire up enough to warm a pot of meal and salt pork. She fed the dog. She fed herself. She broke out a clean blanket from her bundle and folded it twice and set it across the foot of the sleeping platform for whoever might need it. She did not yet know who might need it. She had a feeling. The first knock came at dusk. She had been expecting it. The wind outside had not slackened all day. The temperature had dropped hour by hour, the way a stone drops down a well. Inside the chamber in the warm air, she had heard at intervals the distant sound of the wind in the canyon, the deep, low scream of it, like the throat of an animal that had no end. The knock was faint. The knock was in fact more of a tapping, the tapping of a hand that did not have much strength left in it. She got up. She crossed to the crack. She pressed her ear against the cold stone. "Hello," she called. A voice answered, weak, broken by the wind. "Please," the voice said. It was a man's voice, old, spent. She drew her belt knife. She did not put it in her hand to use. She put it in her hand so that her hand would know it was there. Then she put her shoulder against the stone, and she squeezed sideways through the crack, and she came out into the storm. There were two of them, an elderly man, perhaps 60 years old, and an elderly woman who looked to be near the same age, and the two of them were so packed with snow that for a moment she thought they were one bundle. The man was holding the woman up. The woman was sagging against the man. The wind was hitting them sideways. There was beside them the dim shape of a small mule with its head down and ice frozen along its harness. "My wife," the man said. He could barely speak. "Our stove. The stove failed. We have walked. The wind." Etta did not waste time on words. "Inside," she said. "Both of you. Bring the mule to the edge of the cliff. The cliff will block the wind. We will find better for the mule later. Come." She took the woman's other arm. They got them through the crack. It took a long time. The woman was no longer fully conscious. The man was barely so. Etta got them onto the sleeping platform. She built the fire higher. She poured warm water from her pot into a tin cup and held it to the woman's lips. The woman's eyes opened. The woman drank. The woman looked at the chamber. The woman looked at the curved walls and the lantern light and the small fire and the dog sitting watchful at the foot of the platform. The woman looked at Etta. "It is warm," the woman whispered. "It is," Etta said. "How?" the woman said. "The mountain," Etta said. She had said the same thing once to Wendell Burrows, more or less. She did not have a better answer. She did not think the answer mattered. The elderly woman's name was Winifred Greaves. The man was her husband, Obadiah. They had a small cabin 5 miles down the canyon on a piece of ground Obadiah had homesteaded 20 years before. They had heard the storm warning. They had laid in extra wood. They had banked their stove, and the stove, sometime around 4 o'clock in the morning, had failed in a way that Obadiah could not, in his weakened condition, explain. The pipe, perhaps. The damper. He did not know. He knew only that the cabin had begun to fill with smoke, and that by the time they had got the smoke under control, the fire was out, and the cold was in, and there was nothing in the world that they could do about either. They had wrapped themselves in everything they had. They had loaded the mule. They had started walking. They had been walking, Obadiah said, for almost 5 hours. "You should not have walked," Etta said quietly. "We had nowhere," Obadiah said. He was not arguing. He was only stating a fact. "We had heard in town about the girl in the cliff." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been told something he did not believe and who now believed it. "We were going to die in the snow," he said, "and I thought, even if there is no girl, even if it is only a story, We may as well die walking towards something." She did not answer. She poured more water. The wind outside the crack went on screaming. The Greaveses had been in the chamber for less than 2 hours when the next knock came. This time it was a young man alone, with his face frozen so badly down one side that she did not at first know he was young. He was a hired hand from a ranch 4 miles to the east. His name was Tobias Hatch. He had been on the trail toward Drummond when the storm caught him. He had remembered he said in the bar a week earlier, hearing the freighter's story about the canyon. He had turned his horse north. He had ridden until the horse could go no farther, and then he had walked, and then he had crawled, and then he had heard faintly the sound of an animal whining behind a wall of stone, and he had felt with his bare hands along the cliff face, and he had found the crack. The dog had not whined. The dog had been beside Etta on the sleeping platform with its head on its paws, watching the fire. She did not say anything about that. She brought him inside. Within 6 hours of the first knock, there were 9 people in the chamber. Within 12 hours, there were 14. Within 24 hours, there were 21. The storm had broken open something in the country around Hollow Ridge that nothing else could have broken open, and one by one in the dark, the people of that country had remembered the freighter's story and had thought of it not as a joke anymore, but as the only door left in a world where every other door had been shut. They came in waves. A trapper she did not know with one finger already lost to the cold. 2 brothers from a homestead near Garnet, both half-conscious, leaning on each other. A widow named Mrs. Ada Crane walking 5 miles through the wind in her dead husband's overcoat with a small leather case of household money clutched against her chest because she had not been able to think what else to bring. A family of 4, the father carrying the smallest child inside his coat, the mother carrying nothing because she could no longer carry anything, the boy of about 9 walking ahead of all of them, leading them, because he was the only one who could still see through the snow. Mrs. Ada Crane was a small, thin woman of perhaps 65, who, after she had warmed enough to talk, told Etta a thing Etta would remember for the rest of her life. She told her that her husband had died 9 months before of a heart attack out behind the woodshed, and that she had thought in the months since about whether she would have the strength to keep going alone. She said she had not been certain of the answer. She said that when the storm had come and her own stove had begun to lose its draft, and she had remembered the story about the girl in the cliff, she had not, in the moment of remembering it, weighed whether it was true. She had only known that the alternative was sitting alone in her cold house, waiting to die, and that she had not yet decided in the matter of dying that she was ready. "And so I walked," Mrs. Crane said. She said this with a small, steady look at Etta. "I walked," she said, "to find out what I was made of." Etta did not say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I am glad you walked." Mrs. Crane nodded once and looked at the fire and did not speak again for the rest of the night. The family of 4 was the worse. When they came through the crack, the father set the smallest child down on the floor of the chamber, and the child did not move, and Etta thought for a moment that the child was dead. The child was a girl. She was 6 years old. Her name, the mother said, was Lila. She had a fever in addition to the cold. She had been coughing for 2 days before the storm. She was the kind of sick that a winter takes before it lets a child go. Etta carried her to the sleeping platform. Winifred Greaves, who had by then warmed enough to stand, came across the chamber without being asked. Winifred Greaves had been a young woman during the war. She had served for the last 8 months of it in a field hospital in Virginia under the supervision of a Confederate surgeon who had let women do work he was not officially supposed to let women do, because by that point in the war, there were not enough hands of any kind. She had been 23 years old then. She had not done any of that work in 34 years. She had thought she had forgotten it. She had not. She knelt beside the sleeping platform. She put her hand on the child's forehead. She put her ear against the child's chest. She lifted the child's small wrist between her two fingers. She closed her eyes a long moment. She opened her eyes. Hot water, she said, clean cloth, whatever salt you have, and honey if there is any in this canyon. There was no honey. There was tea from the twist of paper Wendell Burroughs had given Etta on his first visit. There was salt. There was a clean cloth. Etta tore from the spare blanket she had folded that morning across the foot of the sleeping platform. There was warm water from the basin at the back of the chamber. Winifred Greaves and Henrietta Sumner worked over the child Lila for the better part of the night. They did not speak much. Winifred would point to a thing, and Etta would bring the thing. Winifred would lift the child's head, and Etta would hold the cup. Winifred would unwrap a poultice she had built from the tea leaves and the salt and the warm water folded into the cloth, and she would lay the poultice against the child's chest, and she would hold it there with her old strong hand, and she would say to Etta very softly, "Now we wait." They waited. The child's mother sat on the floor by the platform with her hands closed around each other and her face turned away because she could not just then look at her own child's face. She rocked slightly. She did not pray aloud. Once or twice Etta saw her lips move the way the lips of a woman who has been raised to pray will move when there is no one to pray to that she has not already exhausted. The father sat behind the mother with one arm across her shoulders and the other holding the boy of 9, and the boy of 9 watched his sister on the platform without blinking, the way a boy who has had to grow up suddenly in a single night will watch the thing he has just become old enough to be afraid of. Around 3 in the morning, the child began to breathe differently. It was not a sudden change. It was a slow easing, the way a wound stops bleeding, the way a door swung hard slows in its arc before it closes. The child's small chest, which had been struggling, began to work in a rhythm that was almost calm. The fever did not break, but the fever stopped climbing. Winifred Greaves sat back on her heels. She put her hand over her face for a moment. Then she lowered her hand. She looked at Etta. She did not say anything. She nodded. Across the chamber, the child's mother, who had been sitting on the floor watching the whole time, made a small sound that was not a word and put her hands against her own mouth and bent forward, and Winifred Greaves went to her and put one old arm around her shoulders, and they sat that way for a long time without speaking. Henrietta Sumner stood up. She walked to the back of the chamber. She stood with her hand on the cold stone wall, and she let her own breath shake out of her the way she had let it shake out of her once before in this same room on her first night inside the warm wall of Hollow Ridge. The dog came up and pressed against her knee. She put her hand on its head. The 4th day of the storm, the trapper with the lost finger told her his story by the fire while she was changing a poultice on his hand. He had been camped 6 miles north of the canyon when the storm hit. He had got his cabin shut up tight, he said. He had thought he would ride it out. Then the chimney pipe had cracked sometime in the 2nd night, and the smoke had begun to come back into the cabin, and he had gone out to fix it, and he had not been able to find the cabin again in the snow when he turned around, and he had walked, then run, then walked until he had hit the cliff wall of Hollow Ridge by accident and felt his way along it in the dark until he had felt a strip of warm air against the side of his neck. Like a hand, he said. He looked at the fire. Like a person's hand, pressing against my neck. He did not say anything more for a while. Lost the finger, he said after a long pause, lifting his bandaged hand. But not the rest. Etta nodded. She finished tying the poultice. Most of us in this room, she said, have lost something. The trapper looked at her with eyes that were very tired. Yes, he said, I suppose that's true. The 7th night of the storm was the worst. The wind that night was the kind of wind that did not seem to have any wind in it anymore. It was simply a noise that the world was making, an enormous, low, unending howl, as if the country itself were grieving over the country itself. Inside the chamber, where there were now 26 people, the lantern light flickered no more than it had on the first night. The walls held, the warm air kept moving, the fire burned steady. The chamber somehow was holding more people than it should have been able to hold, and it was holding them well. It was on that night, sometime past midnight, that the last knock came. The knock was so faint at first that nobody heard it. The dog heard it. The dog, who had been lying across Eda's feet on the sleeping platform, lifted its head. Its ears went forward. It looked at the crack. It made very low in its throat a sound that was not a growl and was not a whine, and that Eda had not heard it make before. She got up. She crossed the chamber. She pressed her ear to the cold stone. The knock was 3 soft taps, then nothing, then 3 soft taps, then nothing, then nothing. She squeezed sideways through the crack. The man on the other side of it was lying in the snow. He had been there, she thought later, perhaps 2 minutes longer than a man could be there and still live. The snow had already begun to drift over his back. His coat was crusted white. His hat was gone. He had crawled the last 20 feet she could see by the marks. He had got his hand up against the cliff. He had tapped with his bare knuckles. He had not been able to tap a 4th time. She knelt in the snow. She turned him over. She did not know him for almost a full second. Then she did. She did not cry out. She did not say his name. She got her arms under his shoulders. She dragged him. He was heavier than she could carry and lighter than he should have been, both at once, the way a person is when most of what is left in them is the cold. She got him to the crack. She turned him sideways. She pulled. Somebody inside, hearing her struggle, came to the crack and put their hands through and pulled with her, and between the two of them, they got him inside. She did not look at his face again until they had him on the floor of the chamber and his coat off. When she did, she looked at it for a long time. The chamber went quiet. 26 people were watching her. She could feel them watching. She did not look up at any of them. She knelt beside her stepfather on the floor of the warm chamber in the lantern light, and she put one hand on the side of his face, the way a person puts a hand on the face of a thing she is identifying, and she did not say a word. Theron Doyle opened his eyes. He looked up at her. He did not at first know her. The cold had taken some of his knowing. He looked at her with the eyes of an animal that had been pulled out of a current and did not understand yet that it had been pulled out. Then slowly he knew her. She saw the moment that he knew her. She saw it pass behind his face like a candle being carried across a window from the other side of a house. He started to cry. He did not cry the way she had seen men cry once or twice in her life. He cried the way a small child cries, the deep, helpless cry of a thing that has been broken open and that cannot any more hold itself together. The tears ran sideways into his ear because he was lying on his side. He tried to speak. He could not at first. He swallowed. He tried again. "Eda," he said. She did not answer. "Eda," he said again. She knelt beside him. She put her hand under his head and lifted it slightly so that he could see her better. She did not stroke his hair. She did not, in any way she could see herself doing it, comfort him. She held his head off the cold stone of the floor, which was something a person did for another person, whether or not she had forgiven the person, and she waited. "It is gone," Theron Doyle said. "All of it. Cora May, the land, the horses, all of it. She left. With the money, the cards. I lost." He closed his eyes. He opened them. "I have no place," he said. "I have nowhere." She did not answer. "I am sorry," he said. The words were so small. She listened to them. She let them be small. She lifted her eyes then. She looked around the chamber. She looked at Winifred Greaves, who was watching from the sleeping platform with her hand on the head of the sleeping child Lila. She looked at the child Lila's mother, who was watching with her hand against her own mouth. She looked at the trapper with the lost finger, at the widow Mrs. Crane, at the 2 brothers from Garnet, at the family of 4, at the hired hand, from the ranch east of the canyon. She looked at all the faces of all the people in the warm chamber inside the warm wall of Hollow Ridge. Then she looked back down at her stepfather. She said in a voice that was not warm and was not cold, "Come in. This cave does not belong to me to close the door on anyone." She let his head down gently against the rolled blanket somebody had silently passed to her. She stood up. She walked to the back of the chamber. She stood with her hand on the cold stone wall. The dog came and sat at her feet. Behind her, after a long moment, she heard Winifred Greaves cross the chamber and kneel down beside Theron Doyle and begin in her quiet, practiced way to do for him what she had done earlier in the week for the child Lila. The chamber, after that long, suspended moment, began to move again. Voices began softly to speak. Somebody added wood to the fire. Somebody warmed water in the cooking pot. The world resumed. Henrietta Sumner stood with her hand on the back wall of the chamber for a long time. She did not cry. She did not pray. She thought, "You did not come home, and now you have." She did not know whether she was speaking to her stepfather or to her uncle. She did not know whether it was in some way the same sentence either way. She only stood there in the lantern light with the dog at her feet and her hand on the stone, and after a while she lowered her hand and she turned around and she went back to work. In the days that followed, Theron Doyle lay on a folded blanket in the corner of the chamber, and Winifred Greaves tended to him, and he did not speak to Etta, and Etta did not speak to him. They moved around each other the way two things that have once shared a wall move around each other in a room neither of them owns. Etta worked. She carried water. She tended the fire. She helped Winifred with the child Lila, whose fever had broken in pieces over the course of 3 days, and who could by the end of the storm sit up on the platform and hold a tin cup and look around the chamber at all the unfamiliar faces with the slow, careful curiosity of a child who has been brought back from somewhere she has not entirely returned from. Once in the middle of a long afternoon, Theron Doyle tried to thank her. He was lying on the blanket. She was passing with an armful of split wood. He turned his head, and he said her name, and she stopped. He looked at her. He looked, she thought, like an old man, although he was not yet old. The cold and the road and the cards had taken something out of him that he was not going to put back. He said very quietly, "I do not know how to ask anything of you." She stood with the wood in her arms. "Then do not ask," she said. He looked away. "All right," he said. She walked on. That was the only conversation they had during the storm. The storm broke on the 10th day. She woke to a silence she did not for almost a full minute understand. The wind was gone. The wind had been gone, in fact, for several hours. She had only just slept long enough to notice. She lay on her sleeping platform and she listened, and the silence went on, and the silence was full of nothing but the small sounds of 26 sleeping people and the small sound of a fire that had burned itself low, and the deep, distant sound far beneath the floor of the chamber of the water that had been running for 10,000 years and had not noticed any of it. She got up. She walked across the chamber, stepping carefully around the sleepers. She went to the crack. She squeezed sideways through it. She came out into a world made of light. The sun was up. The sky was the deep blue of a winter morning after a great snow. The canyon was buried. The drifts came up the cliff walls in long, sweeping curves. The pines on the far side were each one of them an enormous white shape, the limbs invisible beneath the weight of what they carried. The stream was gone. The stream was somewhere under the snow. Everything was white. Everything was still. She stood in the snow at the mouth of the crack, and she looked at the world. She heard behind her in the chamber the small sound of someone waking up. She heard far down the canyon the soft crunch of a horse coming in from the south. She did not turn. She knew the rhythm of the horse. She had heard it twice before. It was Wendell Burrows riding up to find out which of the people he knew were still alive. She knew as she stood there that the canyon would never be the same. She knew that the people in the chamber behind her would beginning today become the people who carried the story of the warm wall of Hollow Ridge down out of the mountains and into every kitchen in the valley. She knew that Drummond would not laugh about her anymore. She knew that the freighter's tale, which had been a joke at the bar of the Stockman's Rest 2 weeks before, had become a fact that any one of 26 adults could now stand up in a courtroom and confirm. She knew, in other words, that her position had changed. She knew it not because she wanted it to have changed, but because the storm had changed it for her. And she knew with a quiet clarity that was the gift of having stood still under a hand on a cold stone wall for a long time that the man named Jasper Vane was still out there, and that he too would have to come to a kind of reckoning with what the storm had done. She did not have to wait long. Jasper Vane rode into the canyon 2 days later. He came with another man, a smaller man, on a sorrel horse, and he had a leather case across his saddle horn, and he wore a black coat with a velvet collar that did not even from a distance look like a coat a man wore in Montana in December. He came up the canyon at a leisurely pace, as if he had a great deal of time, and as if a great deal of time were owed to him. By the time he reached the crack, there were 32 people standing in the snow. Some of them had come out of the chamber. Some of them had ridden up that morning from Drummond, because the word had come down out of the canyon by then, in pieces in the mouths of the trappers and the wagon drivers and the hands who had been there during the storm and had since gone home to tell what they had seen. Wendell Burrows was there. Obadiah Greaves was there with his wife on a folded blanket beside him. Mrs. Ada Crane was there. The family of 4 was there. The hired hand from the East Ranch was there. The 2 brothers from Garnet were there. The child Lila was there in her mother's arms, her face still pale, but her eyes open watching. And Ambrose Sinclair was there. Ambrose Sinclair, who had not, in fact, ridden back to Helena after his earlier visit. Ambrose Sinclair, who had spent the storm in a small inn in Drummond, working steadily through a stack of papers he had carried up from the Federal Land Office. Ambrose Sinclair, who had not told Etta, the first time he had visited her, the full truth of what he was, because he had not yet been certain what he would find. He stood beside her now in the snow. He had not that morning been wearing the long traveling coat she had seen him in before. He had been wearing instead a dark wool coat with a small brass insignia pinned over the breast pocket, and Henrietta Sumner had seen the insignia, and she had understood before he had said a word what he was. Federal Land Survey, United States Government. Beside Ambrose Sinclair, slightly behind him, stood another man Etta had not expected to see. He was a small, neat man with white side whiskers, and he wore a long black coat and carried a leather portfolio under one arm. He was Cyrus Calloway. He had ridden up from Drummond at first light that morning when the word had reached him about what was coming, and he had brought with him the papers Etta had given him a week before the marriage record and the birth record, and a notarized copy of the affidavit she had signed in his office regarding the contents of her uncle's journal. He had not been certain riding up whether the documents would be needed. He had decided in any case to bring them. Jasper Vane reined in his horse. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the cliff. He looked at Etta. "You are the girl," he said. "I am," Etta said. Jasper Vane smiled. It was a thin smile. "I have come to discuss," he said, "a matter of legal title." "All right," Etta said. He swung down out of his saddle. He opened his leather case. He took from it a set of folded papers. He unfolded them. He held them up. "These," he said, in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "are the original filing documents for the mineral claim on this canyon, filed in the autumn of 1879, signed by a man named Lemuel Sumner." He paused. "Lemuel Sumner died without heirs in October of that year," he said. "His claim has been held in escrow by a private firm in Helena. I represent that firm. As the duly authorized agent of the holder of these papers, I am here today to take formal possession of this land and of any improvements upon it, and to require the immediate removal of any unauthorized persons currently in occupation. He looked at Etta. He smiled the thin smile again. He held out the papers. Ambrose Sinclair stepped forward. He stepped forward quietly, the way he did everything, and he held out one hand and he said, "May I see the papers, please?" Jasper Vane looked at him. Jasper Vane looked at the insignia on his coat. The color went out of Jasper Vane's face, slowly, in a way that was almost interesting to watch. "Of course," Jasper Vane said. He handed over the papers. Ambrose Sinclair stood in the snow and read the papers. He read them slowly. He read them without expression. He took from the satchel at his side another set of papers, also folded, and he unfolded these as well, and he laid them out beside the first set in the snow. He took from his coat pocket a small magnifying glass. He looked at the signatures. He looked at the date stamps. He looked at the watermarks. He looked at the seal. Cyrus Calloway, who had been standing slightly behind, stepped forward and laid his own portfolio beside the papers in the snow. He did not unfold it. He waited. Ambrose Sinclair stood up. He looked at Jasper Vane. "Sir," he said, "these documents are forgeries." A small silence came down over the crowd in the snow. "The signature," Ambrose Sinclair said quietly, "is not the signature of Lemuel Sumner. I have spent 4 days comparing it against the man's actual signature in the federal records in Helena. The hand is wrong. The slant is wrong. The pressure on the downstroke is wrong. The date stamp uses a font that the Helena Land Office did not employ until 1884. And the seal," he said, lifting it gently between his thumb and forefinger, "the seal is from a die that was retired from use in 1887. Jasper Vane did not speak. The actual claim, Ambrose Sinclair said, filed in 1879, names the filer's only sister, Delphine Sumner, as sole heir in the event of the filer's death or disappearance. Delphine Sumner married James Halloran in 1878. She had one child, a daughter, Henrietta. James Halloran died of fever in 1884. Delphine Sumner reverted to her maiden name and raised her daughter under it. Delphine Sumner remarried in 1890 to Theron Doyle. Delphine Sumner died in February of this year. The sole surviving heir of Lemuel Sumner is, by the language of the original filing and by the laws of the state of Montana, Henrietta Sumner. Cyrus Calloway opened his portfolio. He laid out one by one on the snow the marriage record, the birth record, the affidavit, and a copy of a single page of the journal that Etta had allowed him to make in his own hand on the morning of her visit, the page that named Delphine as the filer's sister. He looked up at Ambrose Sinclair. "These match," Cyrus Calloway said, "the federal records you have in your own satchel, Mr. Sinclair." Ambrose Sinclair nodded. "They do," he said. He folded the forged papers neatly. He held them out to Jasper Vane. He looked at the smaller man on the sorrel horse. The smaller man on the sorrel horse looked away. "Mr. Vane," Ambrose Sinclair said very quietly, "there is a marshal currently in Drummond who would like a word with you on the matter of fraud against a federal land claim. I would suggest that you not require him to come and find you." Jasper Vane looked at the cliff. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Etta. He did not look at her with hatred. He looked at her with the cold, flat look of a man who had made a careful calculation and who had, for the first time in some years, been calculated against. He nodded once, slow, the way such a man nods. He remounted. He turned his horse. He rode back down the canyon the way he had come, with the smaller man on the sorrel horse behind him, and neither of them looked back. Henrietta Sumner stood in the snow at the mouth of the crack. She watched them go until they were small against the white of the canyon. Then she turned and she looked at Ambrose Sinclair, and she said simply, "Thank you." Ambrose Sinclair raised his hat. "Miss Sumner," he said, "the land is yours, the chamber is yours, 640 acres of this canyon, and the mineral claim beneath it are yours. The papers will be ready in Helena within the week." He paused. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the warm crack in the cliff face behind her, from which a faint trace of wood smoke and warm breath was still, even now, rising slowly into the cold blue morning. "The decision of what to do with it," Wally said, "is also yours." She nodded. She knew, even as he said it, what she had decided. She had decided it sometime around the third night of the storm, when she had stood with her hand on the back wall of the chamber and watched Winifred Greaves work over a 6-year-old girl named Lila in the lantern light. She had decided it again on the 7th night when she had knelt in the snow over the body of a man who had once put her out of a house and had said in a voice that had surprised her the words, "Come in." She had decided it again the morning the storm broke, when she had stood at the mouth of the crack and looked out at a world of white and understood that some things, once they had been used to save a life, did not really belong to one person anymore. She did not say what she had decided in front of the crowd that morning. She said it to Wendell Burroughs and to Ambrose Sinclair 3 days later, when most of the refugees from the storm had gone home and the chamber had gone quiet, and Wendell had ridden up to ask her what she meant to do. "I am going to keep it open," she said. Wendell looked at her. "Open to whom?" he said. "Anyone who needs it." Wendell looked at the cliff. He looked back at her. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that." Wendell took out his pipe. He set it between his teeth. He did not light it. "All right," he said. "What can I do?" Spring came late that year. The canyon held its snow into the middle of May. The stream came back slow. The pines, when their boughs shook loose, at last gave up small storms of their own, and the high meadows along the rim of Hollow Ridge bloomed by early June into a thick, low carpet of yellow and white and pale blue, the small, hardy flowers that grow in country that has been frozen for half the year and is grateful when its time comes for the sun. The chamber became a station. It was not put that way at first. It was simply that the people who had been in it during the storm of December 1899 did not, in the months and years that followed, stop coming. They came in the spring with offerings of food and tools. They came in the summer to repair the small shed Wendell Burroughs built at the mouth of the crack to keep the wind off the entrance. They came in the autumn with cured pork and dried fruit and salted fish to lay up against the winter. And they came in the winter, the bad winters, the ones that closed the high passes and stopped the freighters, the ones that took the stovepipes and the cabin roofs, and they came because they had learned the hard way and the lasting way that there was a place high up in the Bitterroots where a person who could not stay warm anywhere else could stay warm. The chamber was the warm wall of Hollow Ridge, a piece of paper signed in Helena that following March and held in a small iron strongbox under Etta's sleeping platform said that it belonged to Henrietta Sumner, but the chamber, which had always been older than any paper, did not seem to know about the paper, and the people who came up the canyon in the bad weather did not seem to know about it either. They came as if it had always been there. They came as if it had been built for them. They came as if it were the kind of place that did not in the end belong to anyone but the night. Theron Doyle lived in the years that followed in a small cabin Wendell Burroughs and Obadiah Greaves built for him at a respectful distance from the mouth of the canyon. He did not speak much. He worked. He carried wood. He fed the stove that warmed the small lean-to where travelers stabled their horses while they were inside the chamber. He looked, when he looked at all, like a man who had spent some part of his life walking through a country that had taken its time deciding whether to let him keep walking. He did not eat at Etta's fire. He did not in any way she could see expect to be invited. Once in the second winter, she carried a tin of warm soup to his cabin door, and she set it down on the doorstep, and she did not knock, and she walked back to the chamber, and he did not the next day or any day after mention it, and neither did she. That was the arrangement they had. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was a thing that did not have a name in any language she knew, and it was somehow enough. He died in the 6th winter of a cold that became something more, and Etta buried him in a small plot beside the cabin with no marker and no minister, and she stood at his grave alone for perhaps 3 minutes before she walked back to the chamber, and what she had felt in those 3 minutes was a thing she did not for the rest of her life tell anyone. Wendell Burroughs lived 7 more winters. He was buried by his own request on the ledge above the chamber with a view down the canyon to the south. Etta and Obadiah Greaves dug the grave. They did not speak much while they did it. There was not much to say. Winifred Greaves outlived her husband by 2 years. She spent the last winter of her life in the chamber on the sleeping platform Etta had built for her with the child Lila, now grown to almost 15, and apprenticed under her in the small, careful arts of nursing, sitting beside her on a folded blanket in the lantern light. When she died on a quiet morning in March, she died holding the girl Lila's hand, and the warm air of the chamber moved softly across her face, the way it had moved across it the first night she had ever come through the crack. And Henrietta Sumner, standing at the foot of the platform, did not cry, because she had decided many years before that she was done crying for a while, but she put her hand against the cold stone of the back wall of the chamber, and she said very low, "Thank you," and she did not say to whom. Henrietta Sumner herself lived a long life. She married eventually a quiet doctor from Drummond named Eldridge Hoyt, who had come up to the chamber one winter to set a broken arm, and who had come back several times after with no broken arms to set, and who had finally said to her on the high ledge above the chamber on a summer evening that he thought he had come back for a different reason than medicine. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "All right." That had been the whole of it. They had been married the next month in a small ceremony at the Drummond Methodist Church, with Wendell Burroughs standing as her witness and the doctor's elderly mother as his. And afterward, they had ridden back up the canyon together, and the doctor had hung his shingle in a small lean-to that Wendell had helped build against the cliff face, and the canyon after that had a doctor, as well as a station, and the people who came up to it in the winter had 2 things to come for, and Etta had a husband. She bore 3 children. The first she named Delphine after her mother. The second she named Lemuel after her uncle. The third she named simply Win, which had been the name of the dog Patch's only surviving puppy, born in the chamber the spring after the great storm, and which had by then been her companion through 12 canyon winters. She did not sell the vein. There were men who came over the years and tried to buy it. There were assayers who came and surveyors. There were men in good coats from Helena and from Butte, and once from as far away as St. Paul. She listened to all of them politely. She let them measure what they wished to measure. She gave them tea. She did not sell. The vein in the end paid for the small things. It paid for the lanterns hanging in their rows on the wall of the chamber. It paid for the medical supplies in the small carved cabinet Winifred Greaves had built into the rock above the sleeping platform. It paid for the boots and the blankets and the lengths of clean canvas that the station kept always in store in case a family came up the canyon with less than they needed, which they almost always did. It paid for the small headstone Etta had cut for her Uncle Lemuel, although his body had never been found, and which she had set on the ledge above the chamber beside the headstone of Wendell Burroughs, where the 2 men, the trapper and the miner, neither of whom had ever met the other, could keep their company over the long view down the canyon. The vein did not make her rich. She did not want to be rich. She was by some other measure full. Her children grew up in the canyon and in the small house in Drummond the family kept for the worst of the summer heat. Delphine became a teacher. Lemuel became a surveyor of land, like the man whose work in the snow at the mouth of a crack had once kept his mother safe, and he traveled in his work all over the western half of the state, and he wrote home weekly, and his letters were carefully kept by his mother in a tin box on a shelf above her sleeping platform. Wynne became a doctor like her father, and she came back to the canyon to practice, and she was the one who in the end took over the small, lean-to clinic, and she was the one who in time would inherit the chamber. The child Lila, who had not died in the great storm, grew up alongside them. She apprenticed first under Winifred Greaves and then under Etta's husband. She married in time the boy who had walked 9 years old at the head of his family through the snow toward the cliff, and the two of them lived in the cabin Theron Doyle had once lived in after they had repaired it and added a room, and they raised 3 children of their own there, and Lila served for over 40 years as the station's resident nurse. People in Drummond eventually stopped calling Etta by her name when they spoke of her and started calling her when they had to refer to her by what she had become, the keeper of the warm wall. She did not care for the title. She did not in any case hear it often. The people who came up the canyon called her Etta. The people who lived with her called her by the names that families use. The people who had only heard of her in the towns down the valley could call her what they wished. She had work to do. On the last evening of her life, many years later, she walked out of the chamber and stood at the mouth of the crack and looked down the canyon. The sun was setting behind the cliff opposite. The light came across the canyon at a long slant, gold and rust, and old red, the colors of a country that had been there before there had been any name for it. The stream below her ran with its summer sound. The pines very high up moved their dark green tops slowly against the sky. The wind was warm. The wind was always warm at the mouth of the crack. It came up out of the deep place beneath the chamber, the way it had come up that first evening. She had walked into this canyon at the age of 18 with a wool blanket and a kerosene lantern and a dog she had only just named, and it brushed against her face the way it had brushed against her face that first time, and she smiled. She had been right that night all those years before. She had thought, standing in the snow with her hand against the cliff, that a current of warm air did not belong in a frozen canyon, and that something here was hidden, or that something here was wrong. Something here had been hidden. Nothing here had been wrong. It had taken her a long life to learn the difference, but she had learned it, and she stood now in the last of the evening light with the same warm air against her face and the same long canyon below her, and she understood the way an old woman understands things. She has waited a great many years to be allowed to understand that the warm air had been waiting for her, not for anyone else, for her. A current of warmth escaping from a wall of stone in a canyon nobody went into in winter, at the exact moment in her life that her life had finally been broken open enough to feel it. She had nearly walked past it. So had everyone else. She thought as she stood there in the last of the light about her mother. She thought about Delphine Sumner standing at a kitchen stove south of Drummond kneading bread, never knowing that her brother had not forgotten her, that he had been on his way back, that he had carved his initials into the lid of a trunk and pushed it back into the corner of a chamber in the wall of a canyon she had never seen. She thought about her Uncle Lemuel, 41 years old, alone in this chamber in the autumn of 1879, writing letters to a sister he meant to come home to. She thought about the small girl she had been when her mother had first told her in the kitchen about a brother who had gone west. She thought about how close she had come that first night under the granite slab in the snow to going no farther. She thought about Patch, long dead now, buried on the ledge above the chamber beside Wendell Burroughs and Winifred Greaves. She thought about Theron Doyle, also long gone, lying under his unmarked stone behind a cabin that had since been pulled down and rebuilt for storage. She thought about all the people who had come through the crack over the years, and about all the people whose lives the chamber had saved by the simple stubborn fact of having gone on being warm. She thought it had not been her doing. The chamber had been there before her. The chamber would be there after her. She had only at a particular hour of a particular evening been the one who had walked past it slowly enough to feel the wind. That was all. That had been enough. She stood at the mouth of the crack until the sun went all the way down behind the cliff. Then she turned and she squeezed sideways through the opening, and she came again into the warm chamber where her children grown now, and her grandchildren small still sat in the lantern light, and the fire burned low and clean, and the long curved walls of the chamber, which had been warm for 10,000 years, and would be warm, she thought, for 10,000 more, held up the silence the way they had always held it up, the way she had asked them once, a long time ago, to hold it up for her. She kissed her oldest grandchild on the forehead. She sat down on her sleeping platform. She picked up her mother's Bible from where it lay beside the journal of her Uncle Lemuel Sumner on the shelf above the platform that she had built with her own hands 57 winters before. She opened the Bible. She read for a while. She put the Bible down. She lay back. She closed her eyes. She lived through the night. In the morning, she did not wake. She was buried by her own request on the ledge above the chamber between her Uncle Lemuel and her old friend Wendell Burroughs, with a view down the canyon to the south and the warm air which moved slowly up out of the deep place beneath the mountain and into the great curved chamber and out through the crack in the cliff face and into the canyon beyond, has gone on moving in the years since as it had gone on moving for the 10,000 years before her, and as it will go on moving for whatever years are left to such a country. Sometimes survival begins with noticing a small difference that everyone else walks past. In her case, it was nothing more than a stream of warm air escaping from a frozen wall of stone.